everyone knows without this family, she is absolutely nothing. My stepsister Brittany's razor-sharp voice echoed through the high-powered speakers. She stood on the lavish stage in front of 200 elite guests, pointing her diamond-clad finger toward the darkest corner of the wedding hall. She shot me a look of bone-deep contempt. Her lip curled, her chin tilted upward. The kind of contempt you aim at something stuck to the bottom of your shoe. And then my biological father laughed. He raised his champagne flute, laughing loudly and proudly, joining in the ruthless trampling of his own flesh and blood. Not an uncomfortable chuckle. Not an awkward cough disguised as a laugh. A full, booming, chest-shaking laugh, the kind a man only makes when he is completely aligned with the cruelty being served. I sat frozen at table 18, the absolute worst table hidden behind the waiter's swinging doors. My hand gripped the tablecloth, swallowing the feeling of a fatal hole being carved into my chest. I locked my jaw, my cold eyes staring straight at the head table. But Brittany didn't know a brutal truth. The most powerful man in the room tonight, billionaire Charles Sterling, the groom's father, the man writing the check for this entire wedding, was not laughing. The hand holding his Macallan whiskey suddenly trembled violently. The billionaire's aged eyes widened in sheer panic, locked onto the pearl earrings I was wearing. He stood up abruptly, knocking his padded chair backward. The chair hit the floor with a crack that turned 3 heads at the VIP table. He stammered, "Wait, you're the girl who..." "Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. But only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I need to take you back. 2 weeks before the wedding. I stood in the sterile hallway of the barracks at Fort Bragg, flipping through advanced trauma medical journals. My boots left dried mud prints on the polished concrete. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting the flat, shadowless light that military buildings all share, the kind of light designed to keep you alert, not comfortable. Between the journals lay a heavy gold-foiled envelope reeking of manufactured wealth. It had arrived that morning in a batch of mail I collected from the front desk, sandwiched between a field manual update and a bill from the base PX. I slid my tactical knife along the seal and cut it open. The calligraphy inside spelled Hannah. Hannah. I traced the letters with my calloused thumb. The pad of my thumb was rough, scarred from years of gripping IV lines in sandstorms, from suturing wounds on the hoods of armored vehicles. In my unit, a typo on a dog tag, manifest gets people killed. A misspelled name means a nameless corpse shipped home to the wrong family, buried under the wrong headstone. In my family, a misspelled name on a wedding invitation was just another calculated insult. 28 years of being Michael Wood's biological daughter, and the man still couldn't get my name right. Or wouldn't. I held the envelope over the trash can, my fingers ready to release. The gold foil caught the fluorescent light, and the smell of it, that cloying, fake-rich scent of expensive paper and overpriced ink, dragged me somewhere I'd buried a long time ago. I was 9 years old. I stood halfway down the staircase of our house in Norfolk, Virginia, clutching my school backpack with both hands. The straps dug into my palms. Below me, my stepmother Susan stood in the living room, physically unhooking my framed childhood photo from the wall above the fireplace. She tossed it face down onto the carpet like a piece of junk mail. The glass cracked. She didn't flinch. She hung an oversized portrait of Brittany in its place. Brittany in a pink dress, Brittany smiling with all her teeth. Brittany filling the space where I used to exist. The nail was the same nail. The wall was the same wall. Only the daughter had changed. My father watched from the kitchen doorway, sipping his coffee from a blue ceramic mug. He saw everything. He saw Susan rip down my photo. He saw the glass crack. He saw me standing on the stairs with my backpack cutting into my small hands. He turned his back and walked toward the sink. He rinsed his mug. He said nothing. Susan pointed a stiff finger toward the basement door. "Your things go down there." I carried my backpack down the wooden steps into the damp dark. A single bare bulb hung from a wire above a mattress on the concrete floor. The mattress was stained and thin, the kind of mattress you'd find in a shelter. A pipe dripped in the corner, slow and steady, each drop hitting a rust stain on the concrete, like a metronome counting down a life nobody wanted to save. The air smelled like mildew and wet cardboard. Above my head, the floorboards vibrated with the bass of Britney's music thumping through the ceiling, pop music, loud and carefree. The soundtrack of a childhood I was not allowed to share. I sat on the mattress and stared at the leaking pipe. I learned my first survival tactic that day. Invisible people don't get shot. The vibration of my phone yanked me back to the barracks. The caller ID flashed Michael Wood. I stared at it for 3 rings, then pressed answer. I maintained a neutral tactical breathing pattern. 4 seconds in through the nose, 4 seconds out through the mouth. The same pattern I used before entering a building we hadn't cleared. My father's voice came through, coated in a theatrical, sickening warmth. The kind of warmth that has a price tag attached to it. Anna Brittany wants you there. He didn't apologize for the misspelled name. He didn't ask about my deployment to Syria or the shrapnel scar healing on my left shoulder. He didn't mention the Purple Heart collecting dust in my footlocker or the commendation letter from the Secretary of Defense pinned to my service file. He delivered a command wrapped in fake paternal care. His voice had that specific pitch, the one he used when Susan was standing next to him, coaching his words from the kitchen counter. I said nothing for 6 full seconds. I could hear him chewing an appetizer on the other end. Chewing while he summoned his daughter like a prop for a stage play. The wet sound of his jaw working through shrimp or cheese or whatever hors d'oeuvres Susan had put on a plate for him. I recognized the ambush. I knew exactly what this was. Brittany was marrying into the Sterling family, old money, real power, the kind of wealth that needs a picture-perfect family portrait to maintain social standing. She needed me there as a prop to feign family unity for her billionaire in-laws. A warm body at a back table to prove the Woods were a complete, loving, all-American family. My job was simple: exist, smile, and disappear before anyone asked too many questions. I closed my eyes. Behind my eyelids, I saw the mud-caked faces of the soldiers I'd patched up in the dirt. A tourniquet on a femoral artery while mortar rounds shook the ground. A chest seal applied with one hand while the other held a flashlight between my teeth. A soldier doesn't abandon a hostile zone just because the odds are bad. You go in, you assess the threat, you complete the mission, or you die trying. I opened my footlocker. I packed my duffel bag, civilian clothes folded with military precision, each item rolled tight to maximize space. I folded my dress uniform and placed it flat on top. Then I reached for the small wooden box on the top shelf. Inside, wrapped in a square of cotton, lay my mother's pearl earrings, the only inheritance a dead woman could leave her daughter. My mother had worn them in every photo from before the cancer took her. I placed them carefully into a tactical pouch and zipped it shut. I zipped the duffel bag with a sharp, definitive click, the sound of a round being chambered. 2 days later, I shifted the gears of my battered military Jeep and pulled through the iron gates of the Sterling estate. The transmission groaned on the incline. The exhaust pipe rattled against the undercarriage. I parked the Jeep dead center between a pristine black Porsche Cayenne and a silver Mercedes S-Class. The contrast was surgical. My vehicle looked like it had been dragged through a war zone because it had. The driver's door creaked when I pushed it open. A valet in a pressed vest and white gloves approached the Porsche next to me, then stopped when he saw my Jeep. He looked at the rust spots. He looked at the cracked windshield. He looked at my boots hitting the gravel. He turned away without opening my door, without offering a ticket, without acknowledging that I existed. I stepped out, scanning the brunch crowd with a medic's triage eye. Threat assessment in 3 seconds. I spotted my father near the rose garden, shaking hands with a cluster of men in tailored linen blazers. He was introducing himself as a supply chain CEO. Michael Wood, a hardware store manager in Norfolk, who couldn't keep his own inventory straight and once lost a shipment of PVC pipes for 3 weeks, was performing the role of his life. His smile was too wide. His handshake lingered too long. 10 feet behind him, Susan handed out business cards from a leather case, calling herself a catering executive. She baked sheet cakes in a cramped kitchen for church fundraisers and once served store-bought brownies at a PTA meeting and claimed she made them from scratch. Everything about them was a rehearsed, airtight fraud. Every handshake rehearsed in the car ride over. Every job title inflated beyond recognition. I stood by the hedges, drinking black coffee from a paper cup, an uninvited ghost observing a masquerade ball. The suffocating cloud of designer perfume and champagne breath conversation drove me toward the quieter corridors of the mansion. I navigated past the catering staff carrying silver trays, past photographers adjusting tripods in the foyer, past a florist, wrestling with an arrangement that was taller than she was. My boots were silent on the Persian rugs, a habit from years of walking through buildings without making a sound. I paused by an open oak door leading into a private study. The air inside was different, heavy with the ancient scent of cherry wood and old paper. Crystal trophies lined the mahogany shelves, business awards, philanthropy plaques, a framed letter from a senator. A leather chair sat behind a desk that probably cost more than my Jeep and every paycheck I'd earned since basic training combined. But my eyes bypassed all of it. They locked onto the center of the cherrywood desk. A framed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Businessman survives horrific crash thanks to nameless angel." The black and white photo showed a mangled car on I-95, the roof peeled back like a tin can, the driver's door caved inward, emergency lights from a distant police cruiser cutting through the rain. My pulse stayed steady. My breathing didn't change, but my hands remembered. They remembered the smell of gasoline pooling beneath the wreckage. They remembered the rain soaking through my uniform. They remembered the weight of a man's skull cradled in my palms, his cervical spine grinding against my fingers, while I held it in alignment with nothing but pressure and the desperate whispered words of a woman trying to keep a stranger alive. A heavy footstep sounded behind me. Charles Sterling walked in, his posture rigid but his eyes holding a weight that no amount of money could carry. He was tall, white-haired, with the weathered face of a man who had built something with his hands before he built it with his checkbook. He followed my gaze to the clipping. He didn't know who I was. He just saw a random guest wandering into his private study. Most people would have asked me to leave. He didn't. He walked to the desk and reached out, touching the glass of the frame with 2 fingers the way a man touches a headstone. "That is my 2nd birthday," he said, his deep voice settling into the quiet room like a stone dropping into still water. "That person gave me my life back." I maintained a polite, impenetrable smile. I nodded slightly without giving away my identity. He studied my face for a long moment, something flickering behind his eyes, a memory trying to surface through years of searching and dead-end investigations. Then he turned toward a shelf to pour himself a drink from a crystal decanter. Before I could step back into the hallway, Brittany materialized in the doorway like a tailored shadow. Her eyes darted between me and the billionaire. The calculation on her face took less than a second, the speed of a predator assessing a threat to its territory. She lunged forward, her sharp acrylic nails digging into my bicep. She yanked me backward into the hallway, her teeth bared in a vicious whisper that sprayed hot breath across my ear. "Stop bothering Mr. Sterling. You're ruining my image." I looked down at her manicured hand gripping my arm. 5 acrylic nails pressing crescent-shaped marks into my skin through the fabric of my blouse. I flexed my bicep, a reflex from years of carrying 200-pound soldiers on my back through hostile terrain, and her fingers slid off like they'd touched hot steel. She stumbled backward, half a step. I adjusted my collar. I walked away without a single word. Behind me, I heard her heels clicking rapidly back toward the study, her voice shifting instantly to honey sweet as she called out to Charles. That evening, the rehearsal dinner. I retreated to the dark corner of the stone patio, blending into the shadows of the ivy trellis. My back pressed flat against the cold wall, a habit drilled into me by years of never leaving my 6 exposed in an unsecured environment. The position gave me a clear sightline to both exits and the smoking area 10 feet to my left. Voices drifted from the smoking area. Chad Sterling, the groom, leaned against the wrought iron railing with a groomsman. A half-empty glass of whiskey dangled from Chad's fingers. The groomsman loosened his tie and lit a cigar, the tip flaring orange in the dark. "Why is Brittany's stepsister so quiet?" the groomsman asked, exhaling smoke into the cold air. Chad sighed, tilting his glass. "Oh, Brittany said she used to be in the military and now has severe PTSD. Like a personality disorder, totally out of control." He took a slow sip, ice clinking against the crystal. "Brittany's family has to hide her away to protect everyone. She isn't normal." My spine turned to iron. I pressed my shoulder blades harder into the stone until I could feel every groove of the masonry through my dress. The diagnosis, fabricated from nothing, weaponized with surgical precision, delivered with the casual cruelty of a woman who had been destroying me since I was 9, had already infected the Sterling family like a toxin in a water supply. My stepsister had taken my greatest source of pride, the uniform I bled for, the rank I earned through 4 combat deployments and a Purple Heart, and twisted it into a disgusting stigma. A convenient label to make me vanish. The U.S. military tested my psychological fitness with the strictest Pentagon protocols before they cleared me to perform emergency surgery on wounded soldiers in active combat zones. The Department of Defense reviewed my mental health evaluations every 6 months. I passed every single one. My stepsister, a woman who had never held a job that didn't involve asking her mother for money, diagnosed me as insane over Eggs Benedict at a brunch. I stepped off the patio into the cold night air and dialed my father. He answered on the fourth ring, chewing something. I could hear the wet sounds of his jaw working the background noise of silverware and conversation. I cut straight through his greeting, a greeting that started with, "Hey kiddo," as if we were close. "Did you know Brittany told the Sterlings I have a mental illness?" My voice was an absolute flatline, clinical. The same tone I used to call in a medevac under fire, no emotion, no inflection, just coordinates and blood types. He stopped chewing. The line went quiet except for the distant clinking of the dinner behind him. Then came the sigh. A heavy, cowardly sigh that I had heard 1,000 times, the sound of a man choosing the path of least resistance for the 10,000th time in his life. "She's just protecting the family's image, Anna. Don't make a scene. Your mission at this wedding is to sit still and smile." He hung up. Not a goodbye. Not a question. Not a single syllable of fatherly outrage that his daughter had been slandered with a fabricated psychiatric disorder. Just orders to shut up, sit down, and disappear. I lowered the phone. I stared at the screen until it went dark. I erased him permanently, deliberately, from my internal casualty list. A casualty is someone who fell in battle, someone worth grieving. He wasn't a wounded ally. He was a complicit combatant who chose the enemy side every single day for 19 years. The rehearsal dinner unfolded in the grand dining room. Crystal chandeliers threw fractured light across white linen tables arranged in concentric circles of status. The VIP table at the center, then the family tables, then the friends, then the business associates, and finally at the outer edge of the known universe, table 18. My table. I was wedged between the hired nanny scrolling through her phone and a cluster of distant cousins who didn't know my name and didn't care to learn it. I wore a plain civilian dress, stripped of rank, my only armor being my mother's pearl earrings catching the chandelier light. Brittany tapped the microphone at the head table. The room fell silent. She introduced the family with a sickening sweetness that dripped like corn syrup from a cracked bottle, thanking her mother, her father, her wonderful in-laws, the florist, the caterer, the photographer, the band, every person in the building whose existence served her carefully constructed narrative. Then her eyes locked onto me across the room. A cruel smirk spread across her glossed lips. She leaned into the microphone. "And this is my stepsister, Anna. She's just a failure. Without this family, she's nothing." The room laughed. My father chuckled into his champagne, his shoulders shaking with the practiced ease of a man who had chosen sides before I learned to tie my shoes. The aunt at the VIP table threw her head back, her pearl necklace bouncing against her chest. The uncle next to her nudged his wife and grinned. The groomsman, the same one from the smoking area, snorted into his napkin. I sat perfectly still. I stared straight ahead. I cataloged every face at the VIP table that laughed. The aunt, social climber, loud, dangerous, in groups. The uncle, follower, weak, will turn whichever direction the money blows. The groomsman, irrelevant, collateral. Coordinates, logged, filed. An hour later, the restroom. I stood at the sink, running cold water over my wrists, a field technique to lower the heart rate to keep the cortisol from eating through your self-control. The porcelain was cool and smooth under my forearms. The faucet ran clear. The mirror showed a woman with flat, expressionless eyes and a jaw set like a bear trap. The door swung open and clicked locked. Brittany stood against it, blocking the only exit. She pointed a manicured finger at my chest, her acrylic nail hovering an inch from my sternum. Her eyes were black with the kind of rage that only surfaces when a narcissist feels their carefully constructed reality developing hairline cracks. "You will keep your mouth shut. You will not breathe a word about your trashy military or your job to anyone here. You're psycho, remember? Know your place." I turned off the faucet. The water stopped. The silence was immediate and absolute. I dried my hands one finger at a time on the linen towel hanging from the chrome bar. I looked at her reflection in the mirror. My eyes were dead and hollow, the flat, unseeing stare of a sniper settling behind a scope calculating distance, windage, and the exact point of impact. "You're playing with fire, Brittany." I unlocked the door and walked straight past her. She pressed herself flat against the tile wall to avoid contact, her chest rising and falling fast. Her perfume, heavy, suffocating, sweet enough to rot teeth, clung to the air behind me like a chemical agent. I walked through it without slowing down. I sat in the driver's seat of the Jeep, the engine idling in the cold night air. The parking lot was a sea of black luxury sedans lined up like polished coffins under the floodlights. My hands gripped the steering wheel until the knuckles turned white, the tendons standing out against my skin. I calculated the route back to the base. 3 hours on I-95 South, then the back gate at Fort Bragg. I could be back in uniform by midnight. Back where I was Captain Wood. Back where the letters on my chest were spelled correctly and earned with blood. Back where my existence meant the difference between a soldier going home in a body bag or on their own 2 feet. I reached for the gear shift ready to abort the mission and escape this civilian nightmare. My palm was slick with sweat on the leather knob. The dashboard screen flashed. Incoming call. Major Sarah Jones. I hit the speaker button. Her voice filled the cabin like a field command cutting through radio static, sharp, certain, the voice of a woman who had spent 22 years leading soldiers through the worst places on Earth. Captain Wood, what's the situation on the home front? The absolute authority in her voice cracked my armor. Sarah Jones had pulled me out of the wreckage of my childhood, the same way I pulled soldiers out of burning vehicles by the collar, no questions asked, no pity offered. She found me at 19, a raw recruit with a chip on my shoulder the size of Virginia. And she turned me into a combat medic who could suture a wound in the dark with one hand while calling in air support with the other. She was the first woman who ever told me I was worth something, and she said it while we were both covered in someone else's blood at a forward operating base in Kandahar. I swallowed the acid in my throat. They consider me a psychotic failure, ma'am. A tense silence filled the cabin. I could hear Sarah breathing, controlled steady 4 counts and 4 counts out the way she breathed before delivering a kill order. Then her voice hit like a tactical strike through the dashboard speakers. Anna, you pulled 4 soldiers out of a burning Humvee last year. You are not a failure. Don't let those stupid civilians strip the rank from your soul. Hold your position. The memory slammed through me before I could block it. The smell of burning rubber and aviation fuel. The Humvee on its side, the engine compartment engulfed in orange flames, black smoke pouring from the wheel wells. The screaming 4 voices screaming behind twisted metal. I ripped the door open with my bare hands and a crowbar. The heat seared through my gloves. I dragged them out one by one, Staff Sergeant Williams, 220 pounds unconscious. Corporal Ruiz, shrapnel in both legs, screaming my name. Private Chen, burns across his back, biting through his lip to keep from passing out. Private Davis in shock, gripping my arm so hard he left bruises that lasted 3 weeks. The 5th Soldier Specialist Torres didn't make it. I still carried his dog tags in my left cargo pocket, every single day. I took a deep tactical breath. Sarah's words solidified in my chest like Kevlar plates sliding into a ballistic vest. The kind of armor that doesn't show on the outside. I ended the call. The screen went dark, then lit up again. A text message, unknown number. I opened it. This is Eleanor Sterling. I got your number from the guest list. I'm so glad you're here. Charles keeps asking about you. Eleanor, the billionaire's wife. The woman who had sat across from me at the brunch and watched Brittany yank me out of her husband's study by the arm. Eleanor said nothing at the time, but she saw everything. And now she was reaching through the noise, through the lies, through the fabricated diagnosis, through the manufactured invisibility, reaching for the truth. I looked through the windshield past the valet stand with its velvet ropes through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the estate. Charles Sterling stood at the mahogany bar inside. He wasn't talking to anyone. He wasn't holding court with his business partners or swirling cognac with the groomsmen. He was staring directly out into the dark parking lot, his eyes searching, scanning left to right the way a man does when he has lost something important and just realized it might be closer than he thought. He was putting the pieces together. The newspaper clipping, the pearl earrings, the quiet woman with the calloused hands who knew the weight of a human skull. I looked down at my ignition key. The engine hummed, ready to carry me 3 hours west and away from all of this. Sarah's voice echoed in the back of my skull, hard as a bullet casing. Hold your position. I twisted the key. The engine died. The silence was immediate. I pulled the keys out and dropped them in my clutch. I stepped back into the freezing night air. A valet near the glass doors looked me up and down my plain dress, my flat boots, the absence of a designer clutch, and turned his back without a word. I walked past him, pulled the heavy door open with my own hand, and stepped back into the lion's den. Standing alone against your own blood is a brutal battlefield. If you've ever had to brace yourself and set boundaries with toxic family like this video, and share your story in the comments. The wedding day. 200 of the city's most powerful people packed the grand reception hall. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceiling on brass chains. White roses spilled from every surface. A string quartet played something soft and classical that nobody was listening to. Waiters in white gloves carried champagne trays through the crowd like medics navigating a battlefield, dodging elbows, sidestepping children, keeping the glasses from spilling. I was exiled to table 18. Table 18 sat against the farthest back wall, shoved against the swinging kitchen doors, where waiters crashed trays of dirty dishes every 45 seconds. Each impact porcelain on stainless steel sent a jolt through my chair. The clatter of plates and silverware drowned out the string quartet. Grease-scented steam poured through the gap in the swinging doors every time a waiter backed through them. The table seated me the children's nanny who spent the entire evening scrolling through her phone, and two elderly distant aunts who compared prescription medications and didn't once ask my name. I sat with perfect military posture. Spine straight, shoulders square, chin level, hands flat on the tablecloth. Untouchable. A chair scraped across the marble floor. Charles Sterling lowered himself into the empty seat next to me, abandoning the VIP section 50 feet away, where his wife and business partners sat drinking champagne that cost more per bottle than my monthly phone bill. His security detail hovered near the kitchen entrance, confused, unsure whether to retrieve the boss or guard the perimeter. Charles ignored them. He leaned in close, and I saw the folded edge of the yellowed newspaper clipping sticking out of his breast pocket. He had carried it from his study. He had been carrying it with him on his person against his chest for 3 years. His voice came out thick, the words, pushing through a wall of emotion he was barely holding together. His hands lay flat on the tablecloth, and I could see them trembling. 3 years ago on I-95, I almost died in a pile of scrap metal. For 47 minutes waiting for the chopper, a woman held my head. She talked about her late mother's pearl earrings. His eyes dropped to the pearls hanging from my earlobes. The pearl earrings my mother wore in every photograph before the cancer consumed her body and left me an orphan at 7. You remind me of her. Before I could answer, a security guard appeared at his elbow, one hand on his earpiece. Mr. Sterling, your wife is requesting you at the head table. Charles looked at me for a long beat, a beat that stretched and bent under the weight of a question he was terrified to ask, then stood and let himself be guided away. His hand brushed the newspaper clipping in his pocket, pressing it flat against his heart. The spotlight swung to center stage. Brittany stood in a cascade of white silk and Swarovski crystals, gripping the microphone with both manicured hands. Her tiara caught the chandelier light and threw tiny rainbows across the ceiling. She delivered a tear-jerking speech, thanking her parents for their unconditional love, thanking the Sterlings for welcoming our family with open arms, thanking the wedding planner, the florist, the pastry chef, the photographer, the DJ. She thanked the valet. She thanked the bartender by name. She methodically, surgically, with the precision of a scalpel, deleted my existence from the family narrative. Not a mention, not a glance, not a syllable. I watched Chad lean over and whisper something in her ear. Brittany covered the microphone with her palm, her lips forming a rehearsed, pitiful pout. The bottom lip pushed out, the eyes going wide and watery, a performance she had perfected since childhood. I read her mouth from 50 feet away. She told Chad I had a mental problem and didn't like attention. Chad nodded slowly, the lie settling into him like sediment at the bottom of a glass. I pushed my chair back. The scrape of the legs against the marble floor cut through the nearest table's conversation. A waiter nearly collided with me as I stood. The air in the room was a physical weight. I stepped out through the side door onto the terrace. The freezing night air cut against my bare shoulders. I pulled a cigarette from the emergency pack in my clutch and lit it with a match from the kitchen matchbook. The orange cherry glowed in the dark, a single point of heat in the vast, cold night. I inhaled slowly, letting the smoke fill my lungs, a filthy habit I picked up in Afghanistan, the only vice that kept my hands from shaking after 12-hour trauma shifts. The glass door slid open behind me. My father stepped out onto the terrace, swirling expensive champagne in a crystal flute that did not belong to him. His rented tuxedo fit poorly around the shoulders. The cummerbund was crooked. He looked nervous, the nervous of a man who knows he is about to be confronted and has no ammunition. His eyes couldn't find a place to land. They darted to the railing, to the garden hedge, to the distant parking lot lights. I struck before he could speak. Dad. My voice was freezing cold, sub-zero, the temperature of a body bag. You let her brainwash the Sterlings into thinking I'm crazy. You tolerate her erasing me from this family. He flinched. A full-body flinch, the kind you see in men who have been avoiding confrontation their entire lives and have no practice absorbing a direct hit. His hand tightened around the champagne flute until I could see the tendons in his wrist. He couldn't hold eye contact. His gaze slid to the railing, to the garden, to the tips of his rented shoes, anywhere but his daughter's face. He muttered weakly, the words leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. Anna, this is her day. I looked at the man who contributed half my DNA. He stood 5 feet away, and he looked small. Pathetic. Hollowed out by decades of his own cowardice, a shell of a man who had traded his firstborn daughter's entire childhood for the comfort of never being yelled at by his second wife. He didn't protect me when Susan sent me to the basement at 9. He didn't protect me when Brittany called me trash in front of 200 people the night before. He was not a father. He was a bystander who happened to share my blood type and my last name. Her day, or the day you officially admit you are a coward. I dropped the cigarette onto the marble floor. I watched the cherry hit the white stone. I brought my boot heel down on it and twisted. Slow, deliberate, grinding the filter into the marble until nothing remained but a smear of ash and tar on the polished surface. We're done. The blood contract between us is officially terminated. I turned my back on him and walked toward the ballroom doors. I did not look back. Behind me, the champagne flute trembled in his hand and the golden liquid sloshed over the rim, running down his fingers. A soldier never turns around for a position that's already been abandoned. I pushed through the ballroom doors, weaving through the crowd toward the coat check. I was done. Mission complete on the severance front. I had said what needed saying, severed what needed cutting, and there was nothing left for me inside this building full of frauds and cowards and champagne-soaked pretenders. I collected my coat from the back of my chair and draped it over my arm. My mother's pearl earrings swung gently against my jaw as I turned toward the main exit. Charles Sterling was standing dead center in the aisle. He wasn't mingling with guests. He wasn't smiling for a photographer. He wasn't holding a drink or checking his phone. He stood completely still in the middle of the polished marble floor, ignoring the stream of guests flowing around him like water around a boulder. He held the yellowed newspaper clipping in his trembling hand fully unfolded. Now the creases deep and worn from years of handling, years of staring at a blurry photo of a mangled car and wondering about the nameless woman who crawled through the broken glass. He stepped directly into my path, cutting the distance between us to less than a foot. His chest heaved, his tie was loosened, his eyes were red. "Excuse me." His voice was barely above a whisper, but each word carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights spent searching for a ghost. 3 years ago, on November 14th, were you on I-95? The exact date, the exact highway, the exact stretch of rain-soaked asphalt where I had pulled my car onto the shoulder after seeing the smoke and the flashing hazard lights. The memory flooded my senses like a dam breaking, the sound of ruptured fuel lines hissing in the dark, the metallic taste of adrenaline coating my tongue like a copper penny, my combat boots sliding on wet asphalt as I sprinted toward the wreckage. The car was folded in half, the roof peeled back like a sardine can. A man was pinned inside his head, lolling, his eyes rolling back. I climbed through the passenger window, shredding my jacket on the broken glass, and cradled his skull in both hands. I stabilized his cervical spine with nothing but pressure positioning and 47 minutes of talking to keep him conscious while the rain hammered down and the gasoline pooled beneath us. I talked about my mother. I talked about how she used to read to me before bed. I talked about her pearl earrings, how she wore them every day, even to chemotherapy, even when she was too weak to stand because they were the last gift my father gave her before he became a stranger. I talked until the helicopter blades cut through the rain and the paramedics pulled me away with his blood drying on my hands. I looked into Charles Sterling's eyes, the same eyes I had stared into for 47 minutes on that highway, willing them to stay open, begging them not to close. I did not flinch. I did not smile. I did not reach for his hand or soften my posture. I delivered a single syllable with the precision of a fired round leaving the chamber. Yes. Charles stopped breathing. The noise of the reception, the string quartet, the laughter, the clinking glasses, the distant crash of kitchen trays collapsed into a vacuum. 200 people continued their conversations, unaware that the ground beneath the richest man in the room had just split open. The hardened, ruthless billionaire crumbled right there in front of the ice sculpture. Tears spilled over his weathered cheeks. cutting through the composed mask he had worn all evening, running down the deep lines of his face and dropping onto his silk tie. "It's you!" His voice broke loud enough to turn the heads of the nearest cluster of guests. A woman in a red dress froze mid-sentence. A waiter stopped pouring wine. A child tugged at his mother's hand and pointed. "You held my head for 47 minutes. You talked about pearl earrings, the earrings you are wearing right now." He reached out and gripped both my shoulders. His hands were shaking so hard I could feel the tremor in my collarbones vibrating through my bones like an aftershock. The raw, unrestrained gratitude of a man who survived the Reaper and spent 3 years, 1,000 days, 1,000 dead-end searches, 1,000 nights staring at a newspaper clipping, looking for the woman who held the scythe back with her bare hands. I stood perfectly still. I offered a curt professional nod. The same nod I gave to commanding officers after completing a mission under fire. Charles wiped his face with the back of his hand. The transformation was immediate, like watching a switch being thrown. The weeping survivor disappeared. The commanding CEO emerged, jaw-set posture, straightened eyes hardening into the focused gaze of a man who made billion-dollar decisions before breakfast. He pulled out his phone, a black device in a leather case, and punched in a number. He stepped 2 feet to the side, turning his back to the crowd, his voice dropping into the low-controlled register of a man accustomed to making impossible things happen with a single phone call. I checked my watch. The second hand swept in clean circles. 5 minutes. 7 minutes. 10 minutes passed. Charles paced a tight circle near the ice sculpture, his phone pressed to his ear, his free hand clenched into a fist at his side. He was leveraging connections, the kind of connections that reach into the Pentagon's encrypted personnel files, the kind that bypass standard channels and go straight to a general's desk. A confirmation arrived on his screen. He read it once. He read it twice. He lowered the phone. He looked at me. His eyes were blazing with a terrifying righteous fury that no amount of champagne or wedding etiquette or social grace could contain. The fury of a man who had just confirmed that the woman who saved his life was being called crazy by her own family, hidden at the worst table in his son's wedding, introduced to 200 people as a worthless failure. He turned toward the main stage. His stride was deliberate, measured, and unstoppable. Charles marched up the grand staircase to the elevated stage. His shoes struck each step with the force of a gavel. Brittany was posing for photos with Chad near the floral arch, her diamond tiara gleaming under the chandeliers, her smile wide and practiced the smile of a woman who believed she had gotten away with everything. Charles reached the MC, a young man in a bow tie, holding a wireless microphone and reading from a schedule card. Charles didn't ask permission. He snatched the microphone from the MC's hand with such force that the young man stumbled backward. A harsh feedback squeal ripped through the speakers, a piercing electronic shriek that silenced the room like a rifle shot. Every head turned, every fork stopped, every glass was lowered. 3 years ago, I almost lost my life in a horrific accident. Charles's voice boomed across the hall, raw and terrifying, reverberating off the marble walls and the vaulted ceiling. The string quartet lowered their bows. The bartender stopped pouring. I was trapped in the wreckage of my car on I-95 for 47 minutes. My spinal cord was one shift away from severing. A woman, a stranger, crawled through the broken glass, put her bare hands on my head and held my spine together while the rain poured down and the gasoline leaked around us. He gripped the microphone so hard his knuckles turned white, the tendons standing out on the back of his hand. She talked to me for 47 minutes to keep me conscious. She talked about her late mother. She talked about pearl earrings. She kept me alive when every paramedic was still 15 minutes away. The room was a tomb. 200 forks frozen midair, 200 champagne glasses untouched, 200 sets of lungs holding their breath. I have searched for my savior for 3 years. Charles's voice cracked, then hardened again, the crack sealing itself with rage. I hired private investigators. I filed requests through emergency services. I offered a public reward. Nobody came forward. His chest expanded with a breath that seemed to fill the entire hall, pushing against the walls, pressing against the chandeliers. And tonight I found her. The 200 guests held their collective breath. Charles thrust his arm out, his finger, trembling, pointing straight past the VIP tables, past the towering floral centerpieces, past the ice sculpture and the champagne tower and the string quartet, directly at the dark, grease-stained, tray-cluttered corner of table 18. The person who saved my life is sitting at the worst table in this hall. Her name is Anna Wood. The gas from the crowd hit me like a concussion wave from an IED. Every head in the room snapped toward table 18. 200 pairs of eyes locked onto me, the quiet woman in the plain dress sitting next to the kitchen doors. The woman who had been introduced as a failure, the woman Brittany had dismissed as a worthless nothing, the woman Brittany had secretly diagnosed as a dangerous mental case. The nanny next to me dropped her phone. The elderly aunt's mouth fell open, her medication list fluttering to the floor. Charles wasn't finished. His disgust was a living thing pulsing in the veins of his neck, twisting his features into a mask of cold, controlled fury. And it's absolutely pathetic. He roared, his voice cracking against the crystal chandeliers like a hammer against glass. That the woman standing next to me just introduced Anna as a failure, nothing without this family. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the kitchen exhaust fan whirring through the swinging doors behind me. Then the whispers started, a low spreading murmur like wind moving through a field before a storm. Brittany's face turned the color of ash. The blood drained from her cheeks so fast her foundation looked like a death mask painted on a mannequin. She dropped her bouquet. White roses scattered across the stage floor. Her mouth opened and closed, producing no sound, a fish ripped from water and thrown onto hot concrete. She scrambled toward Chad, reaching for his arm with both hands, her acrylic nails scraping against his tuxedo sleeve. She stammered, tripping over her own tongue, trying to explain that I had a mental injury, that I was dangerous, that I was unstable, that she was protecting everyone. Chad ripped his arm away from her as if her touch carried a disease. He turned on her. His face contorted in absolute rage, the rage of a man of law. A man who had built his career on truth and sworn oaths, staring at the woman who had fed him a fabricated psychiatric diagnosis to bury an innocent person. The woman who had lied to him about a hero so she could feel superior at her own wedding. "Shut up!" he screamed, and the word ricocheted off every wall in the silent hall, bouncing between the marble pillars like a bullet in a steel room. "You lied to me. You told me she was crazy." Brittany flinched as if she'd been struck across the face. She staggered backward on her crystal-studded heels, one hand reaching for the floral arch to steady herself. Her tiara shifted sideways. Her veil caught on a rose thorn and tore with a soft, clean ripping sound that was somehow louder than anything else in the room. Charles held up his phone, the screen facing the crowd. The official Pentagon email seal glowed in blue and white, the encrypted verification of my service record, my rank, my commendations, my deployments, my awards. Anna Wood is not crazy. His voice was absolute, final, a verdict delivered from the highest bench in the land. She is a combat medic captain in the U.S. Special Forces. She has saved hundreds of lives on the battlefield and is the only person who kept me alive. He swung toward Brittany, and the disgust in his eyes was a force of nature, volcanic, ancient, the kind of contempt that a man reserves for the worst kind of coward. You fabricated a mental illness to trample a hero just to hide the rot of this family. Silence, one heartbeat, two. A man at a middle table stood up. Older, silver-haired, wearing a gray suit. He began clapping, slow, deliberate, each clap a hammer stroke against an anvil. His wife stood next to him. Then a woman across the aisle rose, clutching her napkin to her chest. Then a couple near the bar. Then an entire table stood at once, chairs scraping back in a ragged chorus. Within seconds, 200 elites were on their feet. The applause was thunderous, deafening, a wall of sound that shook the floorboards, rattled the chandeliers, vibrated through the soles of my boots, and up through my spine. I remained standing at table 18, perfectly still, military posture. My hands at my sides, my chin level, my shoulders squared. My eyes locked on Brittany's collapsing empire from 50 feet away. I did not wave, I did not smile, I did not bow, I did not cry. I stood at attention the way I had been trained to stand when the weight of the moment was bigger than any one person could carry alone. The applause acted like acid on Brittany's brain. Her mask, the mask she had worn for years, the sweet stepdaughter, the caring family woman, the gracious bride, the devoted sister who tenderly cared for her troubled military stepsister, shattered into a million jagged pieces on the marble stage floor. She lunged for the microphone that Charles had placed on the podium. She grabbed it with both hands, her knuckles white, her acrylic nails scraping against the metal mesh, and she screamed over the clapping. Not words at first, just a raw, animalistic screech, the sound of a cornered predator realizing the cage has closed. Then the words came. She is trash, she's supposed to be invisible, why her? The clapping stopped. Not gradually, not fading, it stopped like a switch had been thrown. 200 guests froze in position, some with their hands still raised, mid-clap staring at the bride on the stage with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for car accidents and courtroom confessions. The aunt who had laughed at table 18 put her hand over her mouth. The uncle stopped breathing. The groomsman who had snorted into his napkin at the rehearsal took a full step backward, putting distance between himself and the stage. Brittany had just broadcasted her own monstrous soul, unfiltered, unscripted, uncensored, to every person she had ever wanted to impress. The rehearsed sweetness, the designer wedding, the carefully curated social media life, the diamond tiara, the Swarovski-encrusted gown, all of it reduced to a woman in a white dress, screaming that another human being was supposed to be invisible. The word hung in the air like smoke from a detonation. Invisible. She didn't say it as an accusation. She said it as a plan that had failed. Chad stared at her from 3 feet away. The last thread of whatever he had felt for this woman, attraction, love, loyalty, benefit of the doubt, snapped behind his eyes. I could see the exact moment it broke the way. You can see the exact moment a bone gives way under pressure. He wasn't looking at a bride anymore. He was looking at a predator hiding inside a $7,000 wedding gown. He grabbed Brittany by the wrist and steered her firmly away from the microphone, away from the stage, away from the 200 faces that were now watching her. The way people watch a building being demolished, with distance, with silence, and with the understanding that nothing will ever stand in that spot again. He pointed a rigid finger in her face, his hand as steady as a surveyor's level, his voice low but carrying across the silent hall. Monday morning, we will be at the lawyer's office. If you don't apologize to Anna right now, this marriage is over. Brittany sobbed. The sound was ugly, raw, jagged, the wet, gulping sobs of a narcissist watching their entire constructed reality collapse in real time, brick by brick, lie by lie. Her makeup ran in black streaks down her cheeks, cutting through the 3 layers of foundation and contour like tire tracks through fresh snow. Mascara dripped onto the bodice of her gown, leaving dark spots on the white silk. She was forced to walk toward me across the marble floor, her heels clicking in the silence, her head bowed under the crushing weight of 200 judging eyes following her every step. She stopped 3 feet from me. She couldn't look at me. Her eyes stayed fixed on the marble floor between us, a floor she had probably chosen herself from a catalog, a floor she had imagined walking across in triumph. She mumbled a fractured apology. The words tumbled out broken and hollow, a string of syllables that held no truth, no remorse, no genuine human recognition. Only the desperate survival instinct of a woman who understood that the man with the checkbook was watching. I gave her a slow, freezing nod, one dip of the chin. Controlled, measured. I offered no absolution, no comfort, no handshake, no hug, no tears. She had called me trash. She had called me psycho. She had called me invisible. She had called me nothing. A single nod was more than she had earned in 19 years. Brittany collapsed into the nearest chair, her wedding gown pooling around her like a deflated parachute. Her tiara hung crooked on her head, one pin dangling, catching the light as it swung. She looked like a doll that had been played with too roughly and then discarded. A sound hit me from the far side of the hall, the slapping of leather shoes on marble at full sprint. My father was running toward me. Running. Michael Wood, the man who had never once run toward anything difficult in his life, was now sprinting across a wedding reception with tears and sweat streaming down his face. His rented tuxedo was dark with sweat stains under the arms. His cummerbund had come undone. He reached me and thrust both hands forward, trying to grab my wrists, my fingers, any part of me he could hold onto. Anna, I didn't know. I'm sorry. His voice was a pathetic, trembling whine. The same voice that had told me to sit still and smile. The same voice that had hung up on me when I reported the PTSD slander. The same voice that turned its back when Susan sent me to the basement at 9 years old. The same voice that chuckled into champagne while his daughter was called nothing in front of 200 strangers. I stepped back. One precise step. 12 inches. Refusing physical contact. My hands stayed at my sides. My eyes scanned him from head to toe, a full assessment, the same clinical sweep I performed on a civilian casualty in a triage tent. Check the airway, check the circulation, check the pupils. Look for anything salvageable, anything worth saving. I found nothing. You didn't know because you never wanted to know. I squared my shoulders. I adjusted the cuffs of my dress, a small deliberate gesture, the kind a person makes when they are completely finished with a conversation and have mentally left the room 5 seconds before their body follows. I looked him dead in the eye, holding his gaze the way I'd hold a tourniquet, without flinching, without loosening, without mercy. On the battlefield, if a teammate shoots me in the back, I court-martial them. Here, I simply eliminate you from my life. His face crumpled, his chin buckled. The sobbing started, the wet, gasping, undignified sound of a man whose cowardice had finally caught up with him in a room full of witnesses. Stop crying, sir, it's pathetic. I pivoted on my heel. Clean, sharp, a regulation about face. A woman near the exit, an older guest in a navy dress with silver hair who had been seated 2 tables from me all evening, caught my eye as I approached. She didn't speak. She didn't offer sympathy or a tissue or a comforting word. She gave me a small, quiet nod. Recognition. One survivor acknowledging another. She stepped aside and cleared my path to the door. I walked through the gap she created, past the coat check counter, with its rows of fur stoles and cashmere overcoats, past the valet stand, where the attendant who had ignored me earlier now stared at me with his mouth slightly open. I pushed through the front doors into the cold air. Behind me, my father's knees hit the marble floor. His champagne flute rolled from his open hand and shattered against a table leg, the crystal fragments scattering across the polished stone like broken promises. I did not turn around. Charles Sterling intercepted me beneath the portico. The cold air cut around his shoulders. His bow tie was undone, hanging loose around his collar. He had followed me out the front doors within 30 seconds, his security detail 2 steps behind. He extended a firm, calloused hand, the hand of a man who had started his career pouring foundations in the Virginia heat before he built an empire that employed 4,000 people. I took it. His grip was strong and steady. Not the grip of a benefactor handing down charity to a grateful recipient. The handshake of an equal. 2 people who had both survived something that should have killed them, standing in the cold air outside a wedding that had burned to the ground. On behalf of the Sterling Foundation, we will fund the entire battlefield medical system for your unit. Thank you, Captain. I looked at his face. No pity. No performance. A transaction between 2 people who understood that some debts are paid forward, not back. I nodded once, feeling the genuine weight of a promise that would save my soldiers' lives. Real trauma kits instead of expired supplies, real portable surgical equipment instead of the improvised setups we'd been running with for years. Real blood storage units instead of the ice cooler system that Corporal Davis jury-rigged with duct tape and prayer. I walked out to my Jeep in the far corner of the parking lot. The engine turned over with its familiar rattle, the exhaust coughing in the cold. The air through the open window smelled clean. No perfume, no champagne, no lies, no acrylic nail polish, no gold-foiled invitations. Just cold, honest November air. I pulled out of the Sterling estate and onto the highway. The headlights cut through the dark ahead of me, the yellow lines ticking past beneath my tires. The war on this front was over. A week passed. The fallout was absolute. I was running a morning medevac drill at the forward operating base, simulated multiple casualty scenarios, 4 mannequins stopwatch running, when Corporal Davis jogged over with his phone, grinning like a kid who'd found a $50 bill in his cargo pocket. He turned the screen toward me, one finger tapping a gossip column from the Virginia Social Register. The headline was a wreckage of its own. Brittany's fairy tale wedding was the laughingstock of the entire country club circuit. Someone at the reception had recorded her meltdown on a phone, the screaming, the mascara, the "she is trash" outburst. The tiara hanging sideways, and the video had spread through the social networks like gasoline on a brush fire. I pushed the phone back toward Davis. "I've got patience, Corporal." The details filtered in over the following days, delivered in fragments by fellow soldiers who considered the story better entertainment than anything Armed Forces Network had ever broadcast. The Sterlings froze every financial asset linked to Brittany, severing the river of money she had married into with the clean efficiency of a surgical amputation. Charles's legal team, 3 attorneys from a firm that charged more per hour than my father earned in a week, mandated psychiatric counseling for Brittany as a condition of any settlement discussion. Not the fake diagnosis she had pinned on me. A real evaluation by real doctors with real consequences. Chad filed for annulment on grounds of fraud and material misrepresentation of character. Susan deleted every social media account she owned, Instagram, Facebook, her recipe blog, and vanished from the internet entirely. a digital ghost swallowed by the void of her own humiliation. A stack of tear-stained letters from my father arrived at the base mail office. Thick envelopes wrinkled at the corners, the handwriting shaky and slanting downward on each line, the penmanship of a man whose hands were trembling when he wrote. I recognized the handwriting, the same hand that had written Hannah on a gold-foiled wedding invitation. I didn't open a single one. I carried the stack to the administrative building, fed them one by one into the paper shredder, and watched the strips pile up in the plastic bin like snow falling on a grave. I was back where I belonged. My uniform was stained with simulated blood from the morning drill red dye that smelled like copper and tasted like metal when it dried on your lips. But that afternoon, a real medevac came, in a private with a compound fracture from a training exercise, the bone jutting through his shin, his screaming echoing off the corrugated walls of the aid station until the morphine hit and his eyes went glassy and distant. I cleaned my hands in the field sink afterward, the water running pink between my fingers, the antibacterial soap stinging the cracked, dry skin on my knuckles. Major Sarah Jones walked by on her evening inspection round. She saw the blood reel, this time on my sleeves. She didn't ask what happened. She didn't ask about the wedding, or the father, or the stepsister, or the billionaire. She clapped a firm hand on my shoulder. The weight of it settled onto my trapezius like a metal being pinned. No words, none were needed. The weight of her hand said everything a father's hand never could. Everything a family should have been. Everything 19 years of silence had stolen. I smiled. The first real smile in weeks, a small one, barely a movement of the mouth, but real. The ultimate revenge wasn't the screaming in the ballroom. It wasn't watching Britney's empire crumble or hearing my father sob on a marble floor. The ultimate revenge was this standing in the dirt covered in someone else's blood, doing the work that my family tried to erase from my identity. They called me Psycho. The United States Army called me Captain. I knew which title was earned in the mud and which one was fabricated over brunch. That evening, I sat on my cot in the barracks. The bare bulb overhead hummed the same way the bare bulb in the basement had hummed when I was 9 years old. The same flat electric drone, the same yellowish light. But this room was mine. Not given, not allowed. Earned with sweat, blood, shrapnel scars, and the kind of sacrifice that civilians write thank you cards about on Veterans Day, but never truly understand. A heavy envelope sat on my footlocker. Military courier. No return address, but the paper stock was thick and expensive, the same cream-colored quality as the Sterling Estate stationery. I opened it with my tactical knife, the same blade I had used to cut open the gold-foiled wedding invitation 2 weeks ago. Inside was an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner from Charles and Eleanor Sterling. The card was cream-colored, the lettering handwritten in careful blue ink. No calligraphy, no gold foil, no pretension. Just honest handwriting from a man who understood what words were worth because a woman's words had once kept him alive for 47 minutes on a rain-soaked highway. The handwritten note at the bottom read, "Our dining table has 12 seats, and there is a chair with your name spelled correctly along with your rank." I read it twice. I touched my mother's pearl earrings with the tip of my index finger, the same pearls that had started this entire chain of events on I-95 3 years ago. The same pearls my mother wore in the last photograph taken before the cancer took her body and left me motherless at 7. The same pearls that a billionaire recognized from a dark corner of a wedding hall and used to find the woman who saved his life. I folded the invitation along its crease and placed it inside my footlocker, next to my mother's photograph, next to the Purple Heart in its velvet box, next to the dog tags of Specialist Torres, the 5th soldier, the one I couldn't save. I grabbed my medical bag from the hook on the wall and stepped out into the fading light toward the helipad. The rotor blades of the Black Hawk were already spinning the downdraft, flattening the dust in expanding circles across the tarmac, the turbines whining at full pitch. A new mission, a new set of coordinates, new soldiers who needed someone to keep them alive long enough to see their families again. My name is Captain Anna Wood. I have a mission to complete. Family are the people who honor your value, not those who use shared DNA to trample you. If reclaiming this dignity gave you strength, hit like, subscribe, and comment on the moment you cut off toxic ties.